I am so delighted to welcome our special guest to the Plant Circle, Chef Sean Sherman. And Sean, it feels like just the right time as this is our springtime circle, because I think that the first time that we ever met was in the early spring woods,
Hmm.
right? Remember at the
Yeah,
Pokagon Band for that
I
Great
do.
Lakes? Wasn't that
Yeah.
something? Oh
Yeah, the
my
baby
gosh.
ramps were just popping up, and skunk cabbage was out, and the bloodroot was popping, and that was just that early bit of spring.
Oh, it was wonderful. And for folks who have never had the privilege, the great privilege of one of these food summits, this gathering in the woods featured all kinds of amazing workshops around food preparation, plants, and featured a number of indigenous chefs who were there to showcase their craft. Boy, did we eat well. Oh my gosh. I remember every bite, I think. It was all so surprising and beautiful. And I was so excited to meet you, having admired your work from a distance and inspired by your leadership in food sovereignty and really being a powerful change agent in so many dimensions. And everybody at the summit was so excited to learn, to taste the food. Um, and I believe one of my strongest memories of this was I was in the kitchen scrubbing pots and pans.
So many dishes.
Yeah, exactly. And across the way, I got to witness you teaching, surrounded by a team of young people, teaching them how to dress out a beaver, uh, which we tasted that night. And scrubbing pots and pans, you get to listen pretty good. And I really had this sense of not only a master chef at work, but a master teacher at work. I'm remembering that care and attention that you were lavishing both on the food and on the young people to teach them. And there was a lot of laughter as well. So I knew it was good stuff. So in that moment, it was really easy to see that your project is more than food, right? Yeah,
Yeah, absolutely. It always
yeah.
has been. Always has been.
Wonderful. And we want to talk about the much more than. And I think one of my final recollections of that time, in addition to the food, was that I was there leading a plant walk
Hmm.
through the spring woods, and we were gathering some spring onions, green onions, to bring to you. And oh, we were so proud to bring them into Sean Sherman's kitchen. I felt like a giddy fangirl delivering an offering of plants. So, for our listeners who don't yet know Sean's transformative work, you'll get to learn a lot more today. But Sean Sherman is an Oglala Lakota chef, educator, and activist who is known for his work in revitalizing Indigenous food systems across Turtle Island. Born and raised on the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota, Sean has spent decades researching traditional Indigenous foods, cooking techniques, and foodways. He is known to many as the sous chef and is the founder of NATIFS, which we'll hear a little bit more about in a minute, which is a nonprofit dedicated to restoring Indigenous food knowledge and strengthening Native food ways. He is also an author of award-winning cookbooks, The Sioux Chef's Indigenous Kitchen, and just a few months ago, oh, it's so heavy. Here we are. This beautiful new book, Turtle Island: Foods and Traditions of the Indigenous Peoples of North America, which I've been just giving to everybody. Sean is also the founder of the acclaimed Minneapolis restaurant Owamni, which focuses on ingredients native to Turtle Island. And friends, it is a destination all on its own. Go. I was trying to think of my favorites. I couldn't. The corn cakes, the trout, the bison, the wajapi, and the teas. Through his cooking writing, teaching, and advocacy, Sean works to reconnect communities with land, plants, and Indigenous culinary traditions. And one of the themes that we explore and try to act on in Plant Baby Plant is the importance of both restoration and restoration, healing land and healing our relationships with land. And Sean's work adds another deep dimension to that duo in the way that food heals land, heals relationships, and also heals people and communities. So, welcome, Sean. We are so grateful that you took the time to mark the spring equinox with us
Mhm.
and to share some of your wonderful ideas. Let's start big picture, for people who haven't yet encountered your work. How do you describe what you do?
Oh, we do a lot, So natives or North American traditional indigenous food systems is the main driving piece that we do. I'm the executive director, and that's where we have all of our employees and all of our crazy atmosphere of everything that we do, including the restaurant, which is also a part of that nonprofit family. And so, Natives was really designed to try and figure out ways to create food access, especially to tribal communities and indigenous peoples in general. How to really look at a non-Eurocentric version of academia and education, and really think about indigenous education. So not only do we work with indigenous food sovereignty, but we also work with indigenous educational sovereignty. And so we just really want to bring the power of both of those two things back to our peoples. Because a lot of this work is really just a reflection of just what I grew up with on Pine Ridge, not having access to nutritional foods, number one, but not having access to any cultural foods hardly at all. So we did have like a few things growing up on Pine Ridge, like timsala, which is the prairie turnip, choke cherries, of course, junipers, roses out there in the plains, some wild onions. But overall, and hunting, because animals are a little bit easier to identify. But really, like, we didn't have much food growing up that spoke to us culturally, that spoke to us traditionally. And we still face a lot of foodborne illnesses in places like Pine Ridge, South Dakota. And for me as a chef, when I had this epiphany of doing this work, it was really just trying to make the world better, to make the next generation hopefully have access to some of these foods, to understand what they were. And for me, it was a journey, because when I realized that I didn't know anything about my Lakota heritage in culinary, even though I'd learned so much about culinary foods from around the world, and I could easily name hundreds of European recipes off the top of my head in European languages, I knew very little about Lakota foodways. And so I spent quite a few years just researching, and I turned to ethnobotany as really one of the main beginning foundational spaces to research, because I knew that my Lakota ancestors had a full extent of knowledge of plants around us and what to do with everything, because plants gave us everything. They help us build lodging and tools and weapons and clothing, and they help us with food and medicine, of course, and they're woven into our stories and our mythologies and our religions, and it's a part of who we are, and to have all and to see all of that missing, was something that it just was so blaring at the moment when I realized it. And I just set myself on a path to learn as much as I could, and I crawled into obviously a lifetime worth of learning. I'll never get to the end of this education, but it's okay, and so it brought about challenges of how do we bring indigenous foods into the modern world today, and what is the philosophy that I would want to bring with it, so for my philosophy, in order to showcase and highlight modern indigenous foods, I just cut away colonial ingredients of things that European immigrants brought over. And so we removed things that didn't exist here before in the culinary world. So there was no dairy or wheat flour or cane sugar or beef or pork or chicken. We focused on wild animals. We, of course, focused on all the wild plants. We focused on heirloom agriculture. And we focused on the different techniques of food preservation and cooking, and where do we get things like salts and fats and sugars to cook with. And so many questions, and there's so much diversity amongst indigenous peoples that there was no one way to do it everything. And so it was this big journey of trying to understand how to apply that. And, so I just started doing it, started doing native and indigenous pop-up dinners early on when I had nothing. And just, trying to attempt to showcase that there's a place in the world for our indigenous foods still today. And it's been quite the journey, So I formed the company, The Sous Chef, in 2014, utilizing that philosophy, slowly built a ragtag team of people who really wanted to work with these indigenous foods, and we grew over the years. We worked on that first cookbook, the Sous Chef's Indigenous Kitchen. We opened up Tatanka Truck, which was our first food truck. We eventually were able to launch the nonprofit NATIFS, and we started working towards the restaurant, which became Owamni, and which opened in 2021 to many successes. And so we've done so much. We have a very bright future in front of us. And Natives has its vision on not only recreating what we've created here in Minnesota and moving that around. We're getting ready to move our programming into Montana, and we have some monies to do that the same in Alaska. But our goal is to place pinpoints all over the place. And basically, the model is we have Natives has what's called a kitchen program called Meals for Native Institutions, where we're doing institutional foods to get foods directly out to schools and hospitals. We do a lot of education, and that's led by Linda Black Elk in our educational department, and she's got a great team. They do a lot of video work, so we have over 200 videos on YouTube, and a lot of them are plant-based videos that people could find, and a lot of them are cooking videos too. And so we want to continue to create a space and an archive of Indigenous education out there for people to access very easily. And then we also created a market space called Indigenous Food Lab Market, where people can order Indigenous foods from Indigenous producers online, and they can get sent to you wherever you might be. And we also have a wholesale program, so we can sell bulk foods towards larger groups like restaurants or universities or hospitals or anybody else that wants to buy these foods. And the restaurant we use as a tool because we know restaurants will never act as a place for food access, particularly or food relief, because restaurants are privileged to go to. And Owamni is a nice restaurant, and it's a little bit expensive, and it's okay because it supports a lot of jobs. We've had upwards to 150 employees at that restaurant in our busy months, and we've maintained close to 100 employees throughout the entire year. And we've been open for 5 years, and we've been sold out for pretty much the whole time that we've been open, which is amazing for a restaurant. And we're getting ready to move into a new space, which doubles the size of the restaurant. But the way we see using restaurants as a tool is it creates that workforce, which builds a whole bunch of skills around these modern Indigenous foodways, which also builds leadership because we've seen a lot of amazing leaders come up through that work. And we were also moving a ton of food dollars towards Indigenous producers because of how we intentionally purchase from Indigenous peoples regionally, locally first, and then nationally. And we're moving over $500,000 a year just towards Indigenous producers just from that one single kitchen. And it's, for us, it just raises a lot of attention for the work that we do. People get to experience Indigenous foods because unfortunately it's still very rare to find a Native American restaurant across the country, anywhere in Native America. And so that's something that we're attempting to change. And we just want to be a support system for Indigenous food operations all over the place. And so that's, and doing more education like the books, of course, which was a massive piece of work to put together, and working and talking with many people all across Turtle Island, and with the help of the two co-authors, Kristen Donnelly and Kate Nelson, like we put together something that we're very proud of, and we're very happy to have released that into the world because nothing like that really existed before, to erase the colonial lines of what is U.S. Mexico and U.S. Canada and just look at Indigenous diversity and how much more there is to understand and learn from Indigenous peoples everywhere.
Oh, beautiful. This is such I think, a perfect example of working with the food system, right? And one of the elements that I'm hearing, especially in the work of natives, is in the production arena of supporting the and nurturing of food production. And to me, that would feel like one of the most potent avenues for cultural revitalization
Mhm.
is in that work. Could you say a little bit about the way in which supporting producers and supporting food access has played a role in restoring relationships in communities? What have
Yeah,
you seen? Yeah.
I think that, one of the big issues is that there's very little food access on reservation systems, which are still, realistically segregated communities in the United States still today, especially places like Pine Ridge, South Dakota, where I grew up, where we have still over 70% unemployment rates, and there's very little healthy and nutritional food access. And we wanted to impact, especially like the younger generation, because we want them to see their foods and normalize seeing their foods growing up around them and seeing it in their languages. And so we've been working with some schools on Pine Ridge Reservation, like Red Cloud School, and helping them with recipes. And then we decided that we could work on this bigger and broader by just like, if you think about like a rural school like that on a reservation, like their food's coming from a lot of USDA required, lunch program type foods, so there's a lot of basically commodity food program kind of foods going in there. All their foods are coming from big producers like and distributors like Cisco's and Aramark's and Sodexo's. And there's really nothing that healthy, and there's not a lot of training in culinary, and people aren't really cooking healthy, made from scratch meals anymore. And so everything is just kind of heat and serve. And so, in order to kind of figure out a way to create that food access, that's why we created that Meals for Native Institutions program, because we're just doing bulk foods that we could, make all sorts of recipes of things with wild rice and heirloom corns and beans and all of these different kinds of soups and stews and sides and sauces that we could package and freeze and ship and sell to these communities, right? And that way the school systems could use those in their lunch programs easily. We don't have to take over the entire lunch program, not yet at least, but at least we can give them the offerings to start using some indigenous products into those school environments, to start to normalize seeing indigenous ingredients on the menus consistently and not maybe just during Thanksgiving time or something like that, right? And so that's kind of that plan. And, we can move these all over the place is the thing. And we just built a brand new kitchen in South Minneapolis where we'll be able to kind of center and send foods out from this region all over the place. Then as we're moving into Montana, we're doing the same thing. We already have a kitchen in Bozeman to start setting up to start doing that same program a little bit later this year and start just being another regional center point to start creating that food access out there. Because if that younger generation sees their foods, they're going to know the difference between those healthy, beautiful indigenous foods compared to what else might be around them, because I didn't have restaurants growing up on Pine Ridge. We had to go outside the reservation. We had to either go into Nebraska or go over to Rapid City to find the closest restaurants. And, we just didn't have stuff. We grew up with commodity food program foods all over our cupboards. And, lucky for us, we hunted, and lucky for me, my grandparents had some cattle, because they ranched some cattle. So we had some fresh beef, but that wasn't typical for everybody. And we still lived primarily off of a lot of commodity food program foods. And so I just wanted to change the way that access is, and think about that. And so some of it is, creating that program of the market space where we're bringing in, we have over 80 indigenous producers on M that we've utilized so far. And that list keeps growing. And as we start creating our own products, there's just going to be more availability. And, being able to purchase from indigenous producers, we've seen so many of these smaller producers grow so fast just by like with the restaurant Owamni buying everything that they have to start with. I remember one particular group just driving into the city with their little hatchback filled with wild rice, and we just bought everything from them, like 400 pounds. And today we're buying thousands of pounds from them, and they have trucks and vans and that they can move things around, and they have bison and they have all sorts of stuff. And we've really seen them grow because we've been able to just divert food dollars, and we're really trying to get tribes to think about the power of food service, because a lot of tribes, some tribes have massive casinos that feed a lot of people, and there's so much food dollars that go through there. But are they directing them towards indigenous producers? And that's what we're challenging some of the tribal leaders to think about, is that we could really make a difference with the food service operations we have to strengthen Indian country across the way, just by pushing more food dollars towards producers, normalizing seeing indigenous food recipes. And we can be a support service for that. And that's all our nonprofit wants to be, is just that support system for more indigenous food operations and services.
Wow. And listening to all of the layers of this makes me think of the tremendous ripple effects, that you have had and the work has accelerated in Indigenous food production. And it would seem to me that in every canoe full of rice, right? And every basket full of berries or corn, those ripple effects in the community are supporting language revitalization, right? Care for land, strengthened identity, all those good things.
Hmm.
Um, that that's so powerful, and it makes me think about. I remember driving home from that food summit. I've been to many, but that one was so remarkable. As we were driving home, we got to thinking about how to incorporate foods from the land or garden, not just once but always, to have it be part of our lives. And the car full of folks I was driving with, we said, okay, we have a commitment to try to incorporate native grown foraged foods into everyday life, even if it's just 1 calorie, even if
Hmm.
it's a cup of tea or elderberry syrup or whatever,
Hmm.
because it makes such a profound difference um, in identity and relationship to land, and it felt like a kind of resistance. Um, and because plant baby plant is meant to, our dual mantra of raise a garden in all those ways and raise a ruckus. It is meant as a movement of resistance. So could you reflect on your thinking around the way that food choices and food systems represent a kind of resistance?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, when I started doing this work, and I started having the first epiphany of realizing that I had learned so much about culinary, but I didn't know much about my own heritage when it came to it. And, so I wanted to know, like, why was that information not around me growing up? Like, why was that missing? Even though I grew up on a reservation surrounded by Lakota family and community. And, so a lot of my work turned to history, so a lot of my work turned to understanding what happened to us as Indigenous peoples in North America, and especially the history of the United States and its version of colonialism as it moved westward. And there was so much conflict that happens between what the U.S. wanted, which was a lot of land spaces, right? And all of the actions that it does across the 1800s, especially, and how the violence really ramps up as it kind of gets into like the middle of the 1800s, especially. And so, when looking backwards on my own family tree, like, my great grandfather, um, he was born in the sometime between the late 1850s and late 1860s, and he was a young man. He was only like 18 years old during Battle of Little Bighorn on the Lakota side, because they grew up in the same camp as Crazy Horse, which they were mostly kind of their home base was around the Powder River area in Wyoming, and but they would move in vast regions, so they'd center around the Black Hills as their sacred space where they did a lot of meetings, and it was just a very important space for us as Lakota. But we moved in a very big area, and so I think about my great grandfather because of just all the conflict that he witnessed in his lifetime of growing up Lakota, hearing all these stories, especially of Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull and everybody leading this resistance against the United States, and being very young during a massive conflict that still has a place in U.S. history as Little Bighorn or the Battle of Greasy Grass. And then seeing like the Lakota being forced onto the reservation system, to be there during the Wounded Knee Massacre in 1890, to see his kids have to grow up in boarding schools on the reservation and to learn English and cut their hair and to learn non-Lakota ways. And then to see his grandchildren just completely removed from all of that culture, So by the time my parents' generation are born, then a lot of that Lakota culture is already kind of is starting to disappear rather quickly, right? And so I just think about, I was born in 1974, and it was less than 100 years because they don't discover gold in the Black Hills till 1876. And so a lot of this work of like this is a political work because, the United States did such a thorough job of erasing culture, of breaking down people and communities and cultures and even erasing some to completion. And there's so many atrocious stories across history that happened in just what is the United States and beyond, of course. But, for me, like this work was really important to push out there and to have a bold voice to talk about these things because I get invited to talk a lot. We're both on the speaker circuits and we talk to universities and things. And I get invited because people want to hear me talk about food, but I pretty much just lay into American colonization because you can't understand indigenous foods without understanding what happened to them and why we don't have Native American restaurants in every single city in every single region. Because historically, we haven't had a chance to barely catch our breath as indigenous peoples with the history of the United States. And things are still slipping backwards where, we've just lived through the most intense aggressiveness in Minneapolis just this past month, in January. And, indigenous peoples were being swept up in this whole aggressiveness. And, we're seeing indigenous histories being erased in real time all over the place. And so this work is extremely political and we have to be loud about it and we have to be bold about it. And so there's really no choice. If you're going to be in this line of work, then you're going to have to do something that's pushing against the grain and understand that position.
So well said. Thank you. And the resistance and the restoration from this history continues. And when I think about food access, when I think about the food system uh, transformation that needs to happen, I also think about, what are the barriers to that? You have surmounted a lot of those barriers, but they're still there. We haven't erased them. And, it seems to me that especially thinking about the colonial enterprise, that land access continues, I would think, to be a huge barrier
Mm-hmm.
to advancing indigenous food systems, and to think about the ways in which Landback in many of its manifestations, that these are of a piece, that land back and food back and culture back, all of this rematriation work are related. So what do you think about that? Is your work related to land back? I see the beautiful sign behind you. You are on native land. And so could you illuminate for some of the listeners the relationship between land back and food systems work in however you understand land back, because there's so many ways that
Mm-hmm.
it's being dreamed of and enacted.
Absolutely, and I think it's really important we understand the importance of giving land control and access to indigenous communities, indigenous peoples, especially our indigenous food system workers. So farmers and people who are harvesting the land and building permacultural designs and being caretakers like we always have. Being stewards of the land is just kind of built into us as indigenous communities. And we've suffered from so much loss of land access, in such a short period of time. Because when you look at how aggressive the United States took over so much acreage of land across, starting from the East Coast, moving westward, it was intense, and it happened in a very, very short period of human history, just a matter of decades that so much land was gone. And we're still fighting it. Here in Minnesota, they're trying to open up another pipeline and open up the Boundary Waters, which is such a beautiful, pristine area, and we just hate to see that happen because when it comes to these pipelines, it's not a matter of if they leak, but when and how bad it will be. And will this affect some of our really important rice beds and stuff that are nearby? So will our great grandchildren have access to these wonderful rice beds that we've been protecting? And we already have challenges with climate change, which our own government denies right now. And we're seeing it in real time because we're so connected to the earth that we've been feeling it for a while. We've been seeing it for a while. Science can back that up, but we've already known things were shifting. And I think it's really important that those battles are there and we need people to understand like the continuation of just like opening up land to pull resources at the stake of whoever might be living nearby and the environment is just the continuation of that colonialism, you know, and we need to do better. We need to protect land spaces. We need to grow more food, you know. And you know, I've always said like like we have so much work to do and we're not really waking up quite yet as a human species of how connected to the earth we are and how we really need to be protecting it. And there's no reason for us not to be growing food everywhere. Like we have the ability to grow a ton of food, you know, and utilizing indigenous knowledge of which kind of plant diversities we can utilize in our diets and growing more permaculture, you know. And I always say in my talks, lawns are fucking stupid. Excuse my swearing, but it's just true because like, you know, we waste so much space doing nothing. And we're also not waking up with like we're in the middle of water crisis and it's not being talked about at all. You know, on top of all the climate change, on top of, you know, pushing through mining and all of these things that are happening right now, we're seeing the Oglala aquifer starting to disappear. We're going to see massive battles around the Colorado River. There's going to be huge areas of massive population of peoples who are going to be fighting for water, and we're giving it all to billionaires to control, which is the wrong direction. You know, so we need to be really awake, you know. And I always use Palm Springs, California as an example because they have 120 golf courses in Palm Springs in the middle of the desert, right? And think about how much water usage one like green is, and think about 120 of those, and there's like lakes and waterfalls and all this stuff inside there, and it's such a waste, you know. And they're in water crisis, so they literally have like water mandates and rules around them, and they still allow that to happen because we're not being smart about it right now. And no offense to wine, but like so much of the amazing growing area in California is dedicated to wine, you know, and grapes. And no offense, because I'm a chef and I love good wine with good food, you know, but as hard as you may try, you can't live off of wine, you know, and I've attempted it. It doesn't work. Right? So you need food. We should be putting our focus on food, and we should be focusing on like we have these beautiful growing areas, and we need to be really thinking about the future of where we are, the future of our land, the future of our food systems, and why aren't we just growing more and more food? Why are we giving all of our food control to corporations who are just over processing things, making us microdose glyphosate in everything we intake, you know? And so like there's so much that we need to change, you know, and I think we can start with indigenous peoples because we still have some sovereignty out there. We still have the ability to think about rewriting our own food codes, to go outside of the farm bill of what animals we can and can't eat, what plants we can and can't eat. Like we can start to make our own food rules, and that's where we have to start to wake up, and we can use indigenous peoples who can take a situation that's been very bad by having a lot of loss of land access, a lot of loss of culture, a lot of segregation and oppression, and turn it around by strengthening ourselves through food sovereignty and working with each other. And we can't do it singularly. You can't just have one tribe turn around and do it by themselves. We need tribes to be connected to each other. We need tribes to support each other, and we need tribes to wake up and be a part of the whole food system as a whole, and do this across borders too, because we have indigenous relatives everywhere across the Americas and the globe.
What a vision, and it's seeded, you know, it's beginning and more than beginning. And you know, one of the things that you said that really sparked something for me is also the way in which indigenous systems of food production based on indigenous knowledge, based on indigenous soil science, indigenous agronomy, indigenous genetics, nutrition science, right? All of this together is not only good for people, but it's good for land.
Mm-hmm.
And there are so many ways in which indigenous food systems reconstituted in the way that you are moving toward to be a model. Um,
Mm-hmm.
uh, and and plant baby plant shares those goals. Yep. Oh no, lawns to pollinators, lawns to food, lawns to everywhere we go. What are we going to do? We're to change our relationship to place, you know, one lawn at a time, one garden at a time, um, etc. So, you know, Sean, you're a visionary, right? And so could I ask you to envision, to dream, what if the principles of indigenous food systems were centered across mainstream food economy, what would the land look like?
We would have so much more regional diversity, because like again, like we have so much beautiful just environmental differences and variances and plant differences everywhere, and that's kind of where Turtle Island was kind of trying to showcase that approach of just looking at the differences from the top of Alaska to the bottom of Mexico, and there's so much we can be strengthening when it comes to indigenous foodways by utilizing so much more plant and protein diversities out there, protecting heirloom indigenous varieties of agriculture that have been on these continents for so long, and not just again letting these massive companies trademark our heirloom seeds so that for their own control and for their own benefit, and we need to maintain like the control of those particular seeds amongst ourselves, and we need indigenous peoples to be we're the ones that have the stories and the connections and the understanding and understand the spirit of those seeds that have been with us because they're our family members, and they're a part of who have walked with us through everything. And so it's important for us to understand like if we gave more control to indigenous foodways, that we would be really being deeply connected to the earth, understanding the plant diversity, understanding how things are growing, understanding the soil, understanding the nutrients that come out of it that get into our own bodies, understanding just all of this amazing regional diversity that we have, understanding how do we protect our waterways. And there's ways to go all throughout all of this, And so in a perfect world, like we could really, I believe we could do away without borders. I feel like America could, the Americas, could be working amongst itself instead of just extracting from, South America and Central America. But we should be focusing on like protecting everybody, and because every human should have the right to food and water, and we should be really again working together to think about ways to strengthen our food for the future, to strengthen the healthiness of the land and the soil and the water around us, and not damaging it for the sake of pulling out some quick money because of oil or because of some kind of mining situation. We've already seen the destruction of colonialism over the past few hundred years. Do we really need to keep going forward with that, And so I think that there is a path, but again, I think indigenous peoples really are the answer because we can show a different way. Because, think about the food system in America right now. Just think about like what's popular. There's amazing restaurants all across the country, of course, but typically you drive across America, pick an interstate and you stop at a restaurant somewhere along the way. And the food is going to taste the same no matter where you go. I feel like as a chef, I could write the menu before I walk in the door to so many of these restaurants, because they're all just the same stuff. There's no regional diversity. Everything's coming from the same distributors. Everything's coming from the same producers. All of it tastes the same, right? And we can do so much better. I mean, imagine if we had indigenous restaurants all across the way that we stopped at, and you're experiencing from the East Coast to the Great Plains to the mountains to the other side, and you're going to experience all of this cool diversity as you crawl across the continent. And that's the way it should be, and we should be strengthening communities with things that we could, utilize our soil better for, utilize our spaces better for, and really help the world produce. We don't have to wander around the forest looking for foods when we can create amazing, beautiful permacultural forests and food forests that work with us, that we know how to take care of, that we can use as education because it's important, and there's no reason to not have that kind of education around us, and I think universities could take that as easy because like when we opened up Owamni, we had the landscapers, we talked them into putting only indigenous plants around that restaurant space. And then we were able to put the Dakota names of those plants because that's the true name of that plant in that soil where that happens to be, right? And so there's just passive education all around that restaurant. You can just walk around and see these little placards that'll show you the Dakota name and it'll have the English description underneath it of what it could be good for. And it's just passive education, and why can't schools do that? Why can't universities do that? And why are their food services dominated by the Aramarks and Cisco's and Sodexo's. Why can't we have more indigenous products in there? And literally feeding people healthy foods and prioritizing purchasing from local and non-corporate, you know. We need to get away from all of that. And we're showing a path that food service does have, we can exist as an indigenous focused health food restaurant in those spaces, and crawl into all of that. And that's what we're trying to do, you know, and it's going to be an uphill battle, but I think we can pull it off. And I think that we can work with some of the tribal schools, so tribal colleges, and start to really turn their food services around so they're not just serving the same blahness that's out there all over the place, you know. So there's a lot of work to do, but there's futures out there that are attainable if we work together on
That's a vision I want to be part of. And I
it.
imagine the baby planters um, thinking about the ways in which they can support the work that you were doing, support this vision. Uh, One of the things that I so appreciate, value about the Turtle Island book is this bioregional approach.
Mhm.
And you know, here it is, here in the Great Lakes, almost on the cusp of maple season, for
Mhm.
example.
It's already started here.
Yeah, are you tapping already? Yeah,
Mhm. Yeah, it's
wonderful.
50 degrees today here.
Woo,
Yeah.
wow. And having maple sugar, maple syrup in the pantry is really important to many. But that's one of the things that I really like in the book is your suggestions for what should be in your pantry to be able to continue to support Indigenous food systems. And one of the I think very humble and delicious items that you suggest we might have in our pantries is associated with the buds of spring. So, given the theme of this plant circle as buds, could you tell us about dandelion capers?
Yeah, no, I think they're wonderful, and I think it's an easy one because there's obviously so many cool buds that pop up in the springtime that we could be utilizing. And something like pickling is just an easy way to, you know, to preserve it and hold on to it, and something fun that you can utilize. And it's a great conversation around it too, to be able to break it out for whatever might happen throughout the rest of the year, you know. But, you know, we've done elderberry buds and chokecherry buds, and obviously the dandelion buds, and you know, there's so many things. And of course, we have the cool milkweed buds, and that's a little bit later, but you know, things like that. There's all sorts of cool stuff, you know. So it's just being creative. And I feel like that's a wonderful part about the chefs and being in the culinary world is that we have so much limitless opportunity for creativity around our foods that we don't always have to be stuck in one way. We don't always have to be stuck in the past. Traditions are important, yes, but we also have the ability to evolve every single day by just trying something new and moving in a different direction, you know.
Yes, and to celebrate the season, the place, the gifts
Mhm.
of the plants around us.
Absolutely. And understanding that cycle and being excited when things, because right now, like Maple just started and this is the start of everything again, you know. And I just saw the beautiful full moon come out, you know, I think it was just 2 nights ago, but it's just like that's the start, you know.
Yeah, yeah. When that maple medicine first comes to us,
Hmm.
yeah. For us, we say that's the new year, right? The new
Yeah,
year
absolutely. It's where it all
when
begins
water.
again.
Yeah, yeah. So beautiful. So it's that celebration of place and culture and food as mediated by our plant relatives, no?
Hmm.
You know, I want to honor Sean, your voice in Minneapolis and the way that your voice has echoed from Minneapolis as a vocal critic of the aggression, of the fear, of the consequences of ICE action and aggression. And in your Substack, I was really taken with your declaration, the quote, "Food systems don't lie." Um, Restaurants are like canaries in a coal mine, and the whistle is blowing. So your voice was so is continues to be so important as a voice of truth, integrity, resistance, and so there's the piece of being a powerful critic of what's going on, but also celebrating the resistance that you are a part of and that we all witnessed in Minneapolis, and the way that this resistance was creative, peaceful, and effective in
Hmm.
changing the story. So Chimagwech for your voice in that. It was so powerful. And many in our audience aspire to be part of a resistance movement, resisting the dismantling of land protections, assaults on our values, on our people, on difference, all of this, right? So
Hmm.
I'm wondering, from the heart of this resistance, are there is there a are there a couple of things, something you've observed or learned about what are the conditions that enable that kind of peaceful, generative, and effective resistance?
Yeah, it was something that was really it was such a crazy time that happened in Minneapolis. We were out of the country when we saw the videos of Renee Good being murdered, in Minneapolis on our streets and just a few blocks from our businesses. And just the way this administration just doubled down on its aggression, and it just made things worse. And we were in emergency mode this whole time, because as restaurant people, we have many people of color working with us, and like we're largely just indigenous because we have a ton of indigenous peoples, but we also have people from other countries. We have people from Ecuador and Mexico and other places too. And it was really difficult to see this happened because there was no safety net for us in the city. Our state couldn't do anything about these masked gangs of just hidden faces and no badges and people just breaking laws, breaking windows, pulling people out of cars, beating people up, spraying kids with chemicals, stopping, like harassing schools. Our whole school system shut down across the city because it wasn't safe to go to school because of our own government. And that was insane. And it wasn't about fraud. It wasn't about Ethiopian, like stealing money from the United States. It wasn't about dangerous criminals. This was just a racist movement. And we see in the news how people are saying, "Oh, this is unprecedented." But as people of color, like we've seen this happen. This has been a norm for us for most of the United States history. And so it was really important for us to come together. And I think some of the conditions, I feel like this administration wanted us to create a circumstance like the George Floyd uprising. And I think they wanted violence. I think they wanted people to start something so they could make themselves more aggressive. But we didn't want that. We didn't want to fall for the bait. And Minneapolis just kind of came together almost overnight. It felt like there was all of a sudden just a network of resistance, of people communicating with each other, of helping to get food to families that need it, that were trying to hide from our own government, of trying to get safe passage to workers, just trying to get to work. And the restaurant industry was collapsing. I don't think we could have lasted another month in Minneapolis. I think most restaurants would have shut down because there was no way. We had to stop and ask ourselves, can we open up a new restaurant under a fascist police state? Like, we shouldn't be having that conversation in America, but that's what we had to stop and do because we're getting ready to open up a larger restaurant, and we had to like address that particular situation because it was happening to us in real time. And the media wasn't portraying everything that was happening because we were on all these signal chats all over the place, and so much amazing like support and relief for coming in, and that we were just getting people rental support, food support, just supplies. It was different than COVID completely, because this was unnecessary. This was something that could be controlled by just not doing it, right? And so, but again, like our own cities couldn't help us, our police systems couldn't help us, our state governments couldn't help us. It was just overrun with stuff, and we had nobody to rely on but ourselves. And I thought we really did it well. And I think that everybody in Minneapolis is very proud of how we stood up against this resistance. And the biggest thing is like we just didn't want this to happen to other cities across the United States. And so for me, coming from the food service industry, I also realized that I've gotten a lot of attention as a chef, and we're connected to other bigger name chefs. So I wrote a letter. I called up some of my friends like Jose Los Angeles, and we were able to meet in Washington and bring a letter with over nearly 3,000 signatures directly to Tina Smith's office to the Senate. And just like, you guys cannot fund DHS more money if this is the aggression that they're going to do. If they're just going to lawlessly terrorize American cities, this cannot happen in other cities. Like, we can weather the ice here in Minneapolis because that's what we do, but we can't see this happening across America. So you guys have to hold the line. You have to just not fund more money because they already had billions of dollars and they're asking for more billions of dollars, you know? And so I was just trying to use my voice, and we were all just trying to do the best we can, you know, because we came together early before all that aggression in December and met. So we had a lot of Somali leaders and people from the Latin community meeting with us, and people from the city and people from Ilhan's office. And we all were just trying to get in front of what we saw coming, assuming there was going to be massive food relief, but we didn't know how bad it was going to get, that they were just going to get away with literal murder in the streets and double down on what they were doing, you know. And there's still, it hasn't cleared out. They're still harassing us, you know. There's still like nearly 1,000 agents still in Minneapolis when we had 150 for a 5-state region before all this started, you know. So there's no drawdown yet. It's still completely happening, and their home base happens to be right above Badote, which is the center space for all Dakota people, and it's right in Fort Snelling, where one of America's first concentration camps after the Dakota Wars happened. You know, where my direct relatives come from, because we were kicked out of Minnesota and forced into Crow Creek, South Dakota, through a long boat ride. And so it's just even more salt in the wound to have that headquarters right there and that really traumatic space for us as Indigenous peoples.
Thank you for that really powerful witness, that guides us all. You know, you've created a kind of a medicine that can be disseminated for how to do this. So Chimagwech, for that powerful and ongoing work that invites every one of us into that space. You know, we are celebrating, this plant circle takes place on the vernal equinox, when darkness and lightness are exactly equal, no? And
Mhm.
from now to the solstice, the light is winning. And,
Yeah.
and this time of enhanced light and energy and all that that symbolizes as well is also the time of buds opening. So as
Mhm.
the light grows, Sean, what buds do you want to see open in the season ahead? What emergence needs to happen?
You know, where we are in Minneapolis, we're still catching our breath from what happened in January and even into February here. So it felt like the longest year during that month. And I feel like we're still very connected and we haven't let our guard down quite yet. But we see a path to strengthen ourselves, you know, to be there for each other, to support each other, to do what we can to support those who are most vulnerable, you know, because I had to witness, you know, 3 of my own employees be, you know, terrorized at gunpoint from our own government, and one of them abducted, and for us to have to fight to get him back out, you know. And I feel like it really brought us together a little bit closer. And I feel like I think the whole city kind of feels like that right now, that we're deeply connected. And we hope that we can really stand against, you know, what is fascism, you know, what is this aggressiveness of authoritarianism. And like we can show a better way. There's better ways out there, and you know, and we're just going to continue on our path of trying to strengthen Indigenous peoples and their food systems, and to get healthy food out, and to make sure the younger generation has access to the food, and to share education, because we don't need to put a monetary value on education every single time. We can just share beautiful knowledge to help people in the future. And that's what we're attempting to do. And again, this is a group effort. So we need people like yourselves with the storytelling that you're doing. We need people all over the place to come together and to work with each other and to lift each other up, because that's what makes us stronger. It's a people's movement that breaks this aggressiveness.
Mm. We hear your invitation, and you are an example, I think, of in those times when our so-called leaders won't lead, the people lead.
Hmm.
And the emergence of leaders like yourself are a real gift. So thank you for everything that you do, that you will do, and for joining us on the Plant Circle.
All right. Mopila.
We'll be